Morning everyone. For Summer of Boxes number 4, today we're going to build, hopefully, a nice looking box out of plywood offcuts. If you've never seen one of my videos before, my name's Mario. I've been a woodworker for quite some time, but I've always been a bit of a hacky weekend woodworker, just having a bit of fun. Over the past 8 months, I've really been focusing in on trying to upskill myself and learn different areas of woodworking in more detail. So I started off with hand joinery, now I'm moving on to box making. In a couple of months I'll switch over to something else. If that's the sort of thing that interests you, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can get some tips, give me some tips and see how we go. Today I'm making this box. It's made out of plywood and I think it's Merbau on the outside. Didn't come out perfectly, didn't come out exactly as I wanted, but I probably learned more from this one than I have from the previous 3 boxes that I've made, simply because of the amount of mistakes I made in this one. Definitely worth watching. Cheers. So let's get into it. The very first thing I need to do is cut up all my plywood into 6 panels that are of the equal size and shape. Making squares should be easy. So this box is going to be fairly small, about 20 cubic centimeters. The point of it is I want to make a much bigger one, but first I want to test the theory out before I go and use up all that plywood. So long as Summer of Boxes number 4 turns out well, Summer of Boxes number 5 is going to be a much bigger rendition of it with a few extra features. I have the 6 sides of my cube, something that's a little bit annoying but not the end of the world for this project. One of those panels that I use has got a bit of a warp in it, so I'll show you here. These 3 are perfectly flat, these 3 have got a bit of a bend. Now these are going to be mitered together, but because I'm also going to cut out that miter at the end, it doesn't really need to be perfect at all. There can be a big gap because I'm going to cut it away and fill it. So for this case I don't think it's going to be the end of the world. So I'm going to persist, I'm going to keep using this and see what happens. I do have more ply, but I think it's going to work, so what's the point? Cool. One thing I've learned from my previous adventures in box making is that I should always try to make my angled cuts at once, just all in the one setup. Rather than cutting a 45 angle, then a 90-degree cut, then another 45 degree. If you cut everything at once, the angles, even if they aren't perfect, they'll all be consistent. I think when making this sort of cut, people probably would generally put the fence on the right hand side and then they could sort of stand to the left and push it through. It just doesn't feel all that comfortable to me. So what I've done is I've got the fence on the left hand side. I'm using the gripper, which is just a nice big strong push block rather than one of the other styles, and I'm going to stand on the left of the fence so I can push through with my right. I'm right-handed. I'd rather push it through with my right hand, and if I've got the fence on the other side it makes it feel a little bit awkward. So I think this way, even if I completely stuff things up and I get a huge amount of kickback or something like that, I'm all the way to the left of the fence, nothing can nothing can sort of flick over this way and hit me. So at worst I'll ruin the workpiece and then I'll know that I'm supposed to have the fence on the right hand side. I think the fence on the left is going to work for me. I've always really just done it this way, it's what I'm used to, so that's what I'm going to stick with. If I am doing the wrong thing here, let me know, but let me know why, because it feels safe, it feels secure. I don't see what the problem is, but I know that people have opinions. Cool, alright, I've got a bunch of cuts to make. So cutting by this method worked out perfectly for me, and to be honest it felt very safe. I don't normally like making cuts that leave a very small sliver of an offcut right next to the blade, but I didn't have any issues with this one at all. That worked out really well. I've got 6 panels that look like this, but one thing I've just realised now is when you make a square box, effectively you make a dice. I'm about to go take this all up, and if I've laid it out all correctly, once the box comes together, the top and the bottom are going to have the grain going the same direction, and all 4 sides should have the grain going up. I think that's what I want, and if I've laid it out correctly, that's what I'm going to get. If. So it's been a couple of hours drying, so I think we're good to take the tape off and see how these miters came out. I actually hope they didn't come out too well, because I'm going to actually cut them apart in the end. Oh, I've made a box. So the miters are good, they're not fantastic. There's a couple, this is probably the worst of the lot, where that one really needed to be squashed in a fair bit more. But that's okay. I'm going to cut it off anyway. Table saw router, table saw router, table saw router. I'm going to go the table saw because the router table has got a pile of junk stacked up on top of it. Alright, cool. Now, forward-thinking viewers will have picked up on an error here already. I shouldn't be cutting from the outside of each wall in, I should be cutting from the inside out. Had I cut inside out, I could have made 2 cuts for each side, and then I would have had a lovely groove ready for an insert straight away. But instead, I ended up with the reverse of what I was actually after. To clean this up, I had to nibble away with multiple cuts to get the same result that I could have had in 2 cuts. Doing it this way seemed right at the time, but it's clearly the backwards way of doing things. Don't copy my method here. I'm once again just demonstrating how to not be a woodworker. I think I did that wrong. I'm not really sure. I feel like there must have been a much easier method than the way I did it, because I had to take way too many cuts. I think I had the blade very low because I was scared of cutting into the box, and I had the fence over quite far because I was scared of cutting into the box as well. Maybe that's what I did. I think the end result is okay. It's not looking how I thought it would look, but I'm not really good at visualizing this sort of stuff in my mind anyway. Maybe I should have made a SketchUp model for this one as well. What I'm going to do is clean up all the little edges, the little feathers and all that sort of stuff that's hanging off with some hand tools, and then I'll look at cutting some hardwood trim. I've been cleaning it up with the chisel, which has been working really well, but I've just realised that a few months ago I made this rabbiting plane. It's just got an old chisel in it out of a piece of scrap wood. It's from a Paul Sellers video. I made a video as well. I recommend you watch his one, but watch my one as well. Even though this is plywood, it still kind of works. It's a little bit harder to push through, but it's a lot easier than using the chisel overall. Because it's plywood, and I've got grain going up and down as well, I'm going to finish off all the cuts using the chisel by hand, just so that I don't get any tear out there from using the rabbit plane. This isn't going to be seen anyway, so it just needs to be lower than everywhere else. Cool. Alright, status check time. I had 6 panels with mitered edges. They got glued up. They're in a box. It's come out okay. Running it through the table saw to cut these edges is probably the wrong way of doing it. I probably should have just put it on the router table, put a nice big fat bit in there, and then run through each side just once. That's what I'm going to do with the next one. With this one though, I'd run it through the table saw. I've cleaned it up with chisels and with the rabbiting plane, so I think I'm good to go. I've got probably Merbau. I'm not really sure what it is. And I've got other scraps of bits of wood, so what I'm going to do is just rip up a whole bunch of strips, and then I think I can glue 4 at a time. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll have to do it in 3 separate batches. So I'll rip them into strips, I'll glue them up, let it dry, trim them, and then I'll probably have to cut this side again. So that's something to remember for next time as well. I don't need to cut all these at the one time. And then just keep going and going until I'm finished. And once all the hardwood stuff is done, I'll chuck it back on the table saw and I'll cut probably round about here somewhere, and that's going to be the lid that comes off and then just sort of slides back onto the base. Cool. It should be good looking. I quite like it, to be honest. Doesn't look like much at the moment other than sort of a box. A kind of useless box as well because it's all closed up. But I like it. It's coming out okay. Whew, let's keep going. Ripping down this board was fairly straightforward. These sticks are about as thin as anything that I would want to put between the fence and the blade though. Anything thinner than this, I'd probably pull out the thin rip jig and do it a little bit more safely that way. Now that I've got my strips, I can go and glue them up. However, what I've realised is that the method I use to cut these little corners out, or these notches, is, for lack of a better word, wrong, I guess. The thing with cutting it on the table saw is the table saw does a very nice cut, but if the box is slightly out of square, then one side will be cut a little bit deeper than the other side, and it's just probably not the best way of going about it. What I should have done, and what I'll do next time, is make this cut on the router table instead of the table saw. I don't think it's the end of the world. This is more of a trial one than anything else, so it's still coming up nice. Something I also should have done is I should only have cut two sides at a time, put my strips in, glued it all up, and then put it back on the table saw and cut it again. So now I'm going to have to go back on the table saw and cut it after each set of these strips dry. Once again, not the end of the world, but once again, something that I'll learn for next time. So after cutting them, I've realised that cutting it on the table saw just isn't going to work. My box is out of square. So I'm over on the router table for the first time in about 4 or 5 years. I'm actually going to use the router table for something. And I'm hoping that if I run it through here, the router bit's going to be in the same position and it's going to cut, I don't know, both X and Y sides at the same time instead of cutting one and then I flip it around. Hopefully we get the same sort of notch on each box. Otherwise, this is rapidly becoming a fail of a box. See what happens. So this is the cut on the table saw side. I've got grooves everywhere because it's at different heights, different widths, and it's just pretty much a mess. And then if I flip over, this is the router side. Might be a little bit hard to see on the camera, but these are consistent. Everything's the same, it's nice and neat. This is what I should have done in the first place. So I've stuffed the box by going on the table saw first. Another thing that I've done is because now it's on the router table and I had to go a little bit deeper to clean up the mess from the table saw, now the strips that I've cut aren't exactly thick enough. I don't think I'm going to cut any new ones. I'm not really happy with how the box is coming out, so I'm just going to glue this all up. I'll continue with the router table and I'll finish it off. But I think it's a bit of a fail of a box. At least I've learnt a fair bit for the next one. So here at this point, it's fair to say that I wasn't very impressed. The box looks, well, kind of crappy, I guess. When I was planing and sanding the hardwood edges smooth, I couldn't help but to touch the ply at times, and that top layer on the plywood is only a fraction of a millimetre thick. As soon as I touched it, it wore away and it left the whole face looking very rough. But Summer of Boxes is a learning experience. It's not a commission, so I decided to finish the box off. The edges all got chamfered by hand, and then I cut the lid apart on the table saw and used a blade to finish it off. Cleaning up that cut was fairly easy. I just used a plane and a little bit of sanding. And honestly, if it wasn't for the poor work I did on the plywood and the hardwood edges on the outside, I'd have really liked the box. I like the overall shape, it just looks a little rough because of the way it got finished. And to keep the lid on, I'm using some more strips of melamine coated MDF. I'll probably use a hinge on the big box that I make next though. Soon all I had left to do was apply some finish, so because I wasn't too impressed with the box, I grabbed the almost empty can of spray varnish that I had on the shelf and went to town. And then this happened. The plywood basically changes colour when varnish is applied and it turns a really deep orange. Well, to my colourblind eyes at least. But the surprising effect was that the parts where I had sanded through became lighter and brighter, while the rest of the plywood became darker. And you might think I'm crazy, but I really dig the look. So that's my plywood box. Like I said, I'm not super thrilled with it. I know I made a lot of mistakes, but at least I definitely learned a lot from this one. So it's probably the box that has taught me the most about box making for this whole little series that I'm doing. I'm going to come back either next week or the week after and make the much bigger version, probably about 4 times as big, I guess. That's going to be a lot of fun because it's going to come out a lot nicer than this one. And for full disclosure, I probably should show you how the lid gets attached. Remember how earlier I said one of the plywood panels was a little bit warped, but don't worry, that won't be a problem. Turns out that is a problem. When you go and put in these inside panels here, because the wood is bent, it's actually bending the 2 corners out, here and here. They're wider than the wood in the middle because the wood's getting pushed in the center. So when you go and put it in the box here, first of all you've got to go and sand off a whole lot of the MDF to try and make it fit, and then once it fits, it's such a strong fit that the only way you get it out is by getting a chisel in between there and wedging it. Obviously that's not ideal, so I am going to spend a bit of time cleaning that up, but that's something else that I need to fix on the final version. Overall, very happy I made it, learned heaps, and I know that I can improve it in a bunch of ways, so it's actually a really good project to fail on. Hope you enjoyed, I'll see you in the next one.